we ran the numbers and we realized that we could mitigate 10 times as many emissions, dollar for dollar, investing in Bitcoin mining on landfills compared to Bitcoin mining on the solar farm, and around 50 times the level of emission reduction by investing in Bitcoin mining on a landfill compared to investing in a standard new solar farm. And that was an absolute epiphany. It's not even close, not 3 times, not 4 times, 50 times the level of emission reduction. You need to understand a little bit about computer science, a little bit about economics. You need to understand about energy and how grids work. You also need to understand a bit of environmental science and be able to put them together in a framework which also brings on board policy and regulation. It's a very interdisciplinary area. Now, whether you like ESG or not, whether you think it's a positive for the world or bad, whether you think it started off with good intentions, it's gone off track, or whether you think it's fantastic, doesn't matter. The reality is that right now, if you don't tick that box, then your technology will not be regulated in a favorable way by financial regulators around the world, which means it'll be hard to invest in that technology around the world through sovereign funds, through pension funds, through hedge funds, through high net worth individuals, through pretty much anything. Costa Rica is great. People are friendly. The country is beautiful. And it's a place I'm enjoying living. And the other reason I like it here is it's next to a whole lot of landfills. Not in Costa Rica, but in Latin America. I didn't move to Costa Rica for the beaches. I moved for the landfills.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Bitcoin for Professionals. I'm very excited to welcome our next guest today, Daniel Batten. Daniel, welcome to the show.
Good to be here.
Thanks for taking the time. We're happy to talk to you. Let's just start. For those who do not know you, you're obviously pretty well known in the energy world, in the Bitcoin world. But for anyone who might not know you, can you talk about your career path, who you are before you got into Bitcoin?
So I've ran a few different technology companies, either as an early employee or as a founder. Saw one of them exit in 2019, started 2 different impact investment funds, and we were investing into basically technology that had either a strong social or environmental impact, as well as having a good return on investment. And then little while after that, I thought, well, are we really having that much impact? And I realized the answer was not nearly as much as we could, because we were investing in technologies that reduced carbon dioxide emissions. They would have an impact after 2030. And often they were investing in high-risk technology. And I thought, well, what if we invested in mitigating methane, which is a much more strong warming gas, and according to the UN, it's our strongest lever to reduce climate change in the next 25 years. What if we reduced or invested in technologies which already existed and just needed to be deployed more widely, and therefore could have an impact pre-2030. And that really pivoted everything we were doing and led me towards discovering that running Bitcoin mining operations on landfills was one way that you could do that. In the process of doing that, I also did a lot of research on Bitcoin because I wanted to understand what its current environmental footprint was, the positive externalities and negative externalities. I was hearing conflicting messages from my friends in the environmental movement and also some of my friends in the Bitcoin ecosystem. So I did research from scratch and very quickly came to an understanding which was quite different to what the mainstream narrative at the time back in 2022 was.
Okay, let me get that straight. So you came into Bitcoin not because a number go up technology, not because of the savings, but because you were looking for a tool to mitigate methane emissions. Is that right?
Correct. To have a social impact or have a strong environmental impact, yes.
Wow. Okay. And like you mentioned researching because you were getting conflicting information, as one does. Do you have an idea like how many hours or what kind of research did you spend?
Way too much time. Typically, when you're doing due diligence on a technology, you might spend a month, absolute tops, doing due diligence if it's a whole new sector that you're thinking of pivoting your fund into. But after that first month, I was so intrigued, I did another month. So I did 2 months pretty solid research on Bitcoin mining, and then published some of that information because what I was finding was very different again to what was commonly written about at the time. And that was met with a lot of gratitude by people, particularly in the mining industry, who had
Mm.
frankly been on the receiving end of some not very good quality research, let's say. So they were pleased that someone had looked at it more deeply, someone who understood what Bitcoin mining was, someone who understood energy dynamics, who understood how you incentivize a green energy transition, the economics behind it, because it kind of integrates different fields. You need to understand a little bit about computer science, a little bit about
Mhm.
economics. You need to understand about energy and how grids work. You also need to understand a bit of environmental science and be able to put them together in a framework which also brings on board policy and regulation. And there weren't a lot of people, it's a very interdisciplinary area, and a lot of the people who are researching it really lacked a basic understanding of how Bitcoin mining worked.
Mm.
Uh, they were saying things such as, for example, that it has a high resource use per transaction. Well, Bitcoin resource and energy use and water use and e-waste and all those things don't come from its transactions. So there were some fairly basic misunderstandings. And so I just felt duty bound to say objectively what I was discovering, and that it wasn't this terrible villain that had been made out to be. In fact, far from that, that it wasn't just that it wasn't doing great harm to the environment, but it actually had the capacity to do a lot of good for the environment in terms of stabilizing grids, in terms of helping us to get more renewable energy onto grids by monetizing a lot of the wasted energy that often happens with renewable energy when it's stranded or can't be used because it's produced at the wrong time of day. But also mitigating methane, because the great thing about Bitcoin mining and the anomaly is that a very high percentage of your operating budget is spent on power. And because of that, a Bitcoin mining company will be prepared to go places that make no economic sense for
Mm.
most customers, such as oil fields, such as co-locating on a solar farm in the middle of nowhere, not near a population center, or a wind farm, or even a landfill. And because of that, it's able to soak up a lot of this wasted energy. And when that energy is pollution, such as methane that would be otherwise venting in many cases around the world directly into the air, as it does in most of Latin America and Southeast Asia and Africa, from landfills contributing significantly to climate change. If you can send that landfill gas to a generator, clean it up, turn it into power, and then you have the problem that often it's too far from the grid, so you can't do anything with it. But if you have a Bitcoin mining company, which again is going to be the only one who's prepared to locate remotely on that
Yeah.
landfill, then suddenly you have a customer and it solves that economic problem. And this again is where people often weren't thinking in a holistic way and were saying things like, well, you could do something else with that landfill gas. Well, of course you could at the layer of physics, but you can't at the layer of economics because it makes no sense to spend $30 million for a substation upgrade so you can send it to the grid, or to put a business there that can't locate remotely, or a data center, traditional data center, which needs a high speed internet uplink and cannot be so remotely located. And also it doesn't make sense to invest all that extra capital expense. But Bitcoin mining, it did make sense. And so you had an economic solution. The physics of it works, the environmental science of it works, and suddenly you have this incredible confluence of
Mhm.
factors which mean that now you have a solution where it's actually profitable for Bitcoin mining to go in and solve one of our big methane pollution problems that otherwise was just no one was solving because there was no economic incentive to do so.
Wow. So what you're saying in very simple terms is that Bitcoin mining seems to be the only solution to combine cleaning up the methane from remote areas where you mentioned landfills, you mentioned oil fields, and not only that, but create economic value just by mining. Like, forget about everything else, creating a digital asset that is worth around $100,000 today.
Yes, I would say it's the only one for those landfills and oil fields which currently have been ignored. Because the
Hmm.
ones where there was another solution, that other solution has been already enacted, such as, for example, some landfills, you can sell power to the grid. They are close enough. You are allowed to sell. It doesn't need a major substation upgrade. And so there's many landfills that are selling power to the grid. Some
Okay.
landfills are big enough where it makes sense you can do a biomethane or a renewable natural gas project on them. You can convert that into gas. But that's less than half the landfalls in the world. And so where Bitcoin comes into play is for those landfalls that are too small, too remote
Mm.
for it to have made sense for those other solutions. Or again, oil fields where it was too remote. So it wasn't a solution to be able to build out a pipeline because it just didn't make economic sense. There wasn't enough gas. It was too far away. So it's solving some of those last mile problems. But those last mile problems, they impact, as I say, potentially half the world's landfills and a good number of the world's oil fields as well.
Wow. Um, can you explain in simple terms what is the mechanism of how methane is turned into power to power the Bitcoin miners?
Yeah. So at the moment, whenever you get organic waste, which rots without air, so that's in a landfill because it gets compressed, there's no air that can get into that landfill. It creates methane. There's these little organisms in there called methanotropes who will create massive amounts of methane. And in places such as Europe, then it's mandated you have to flare that, which means you have to burn it. Even if you burn it, it only destroys about 91% of that methane. So some still goes into the atmosphere. So it's not a complete solution. And that may sound pretty good, but remember that methane is 84 times more warming over a
Yeah.
20-year period than carbon dioxide. So that 9% is still significant. Now, in other parts of the world, such as Africa, Southeast Asia, Latin America, and a lot of other places, it's even worse. There's no flaring that occurs. It just goes directly into the atmosphere. And so that's one of the 3 top emitters of anthropogenic methane around the world. It's significant. And a lot of the satellite footage is now telling us that we've been underestimating by a factor of 2 the amount of methane that is coming off landfills. So it's a huge problem. The way to solve that, the most economical way to solve that, where that's purely stranded energy, is you capture that through a system of pipes. Often those pipes will already be inside the landfill just to release the methane from the landfill, and that's done for health and safety reasons.
Mm-hmm.
Problem is that once it's out of the landfill, problem solved as far as the landfill operator is concerned, because that mitigates the risk of the landfill catching on fire or getting methane pockets building up and causing subsidence if you drive heavy machinery over the top of it. So it solves the problem at a health and safety layer, but it doesn't solve the problem at an environmental layer. And so you still have the methane going into the air, it's just more efficiently going into the air. So the solution is you cap those, you pipe it into a central unit, you pressurize it, you take out the moisture and any contaminants. So there's a bit of equipment investment there. And then you send it to a generator, and that's just a huge generator, which rather than taking in diesel and turning out electricity, it takes in biogas and turns it into electricity. And then right next to that, you have your Bitcoin mining operation who's ready to take that electricity that is created by the generator. And you have a little bit of extra equipment to regulate the voltage and create circuit breakers, but that's essentially what it is. So it's a fairly low-tech solution. We've had the capacity to do this for about 20 years. The only bit that's novel is rather than the endpoint being the grid, which you hook it up to, the endpoint is now on site, which is a Bitcoin mining company.
That's fascinating. Wow. So back to you, you mentioned studying Bitcoin, doing your due diligence with your environmental scientist hat on. Can you remember a specific aha moment where something really struck you and that you realized that Bitcoin is something more than just a tech fad, is something that could be potentially very world-changing?
There were 2 moments really. One was when I looked at what else could do this. So we looked at, for example, 2 things. So grid stabilization as you put more variable renewable energy onto the grid. And we also looked at methane mitigation. We looked at, well, what other technologies can do it? So one aha moment was us realizing that whilst there were many other technologies that could do it logistically or technologically, they couldn't do it in a way which is economically viable. So
Yeah.
that was a big moment. And us running a funds, we used to, of course, we understand that unless it's economically viable, no one's going to invest in it. We wouldn't invest in it. So we had to be assured ourselves that this was economically viable. So we put it through that filter, and Bitcoin was the only one that spat out the other side as a yes. So that was one aha moment. And then the second one was when we looked at, well, okay, since this is so valuable and necessary, how could we deploy capital not just to get a return, but how could we maximize the amount of emissions that are mitigated per dollar invested? And so we said, okay, let's imagine that we were just going to finance a solar farm or a wind farm. Okay, we did that equation. Okay, let's imagine that we're going to finance Bitcoin mining happening on a solar farm or on a wind farm. That actually was better because if you sponsor or finance Bitcoin mining occurring on a solar farm, that solar farm can now get a return on investment within 3.5 years rather than more than 8 years. And because it's paying off its loan finance, because it's getting that customer that it otherwise wouldn't have when it's producing energy at the wrong time of day when other people don't need it. It's monetizing that otherwise wasted energy. It's giving it more revenue. It pays off its loan faster, which means it can now proliferate at twice the speed. And so it can now be a much more powerful contributor to the green energy transition. So that was cool. But then we did the equation. We said, okay, well, what if we finance Bitcoin mining happening on landfills? And we ran the numbers and we realized that we could mitigate 10 times as many emissions, dollar for dollar, investing in Bitcoin mining on landfills compared to Bitcoin mining on the solar farm, and around 50 times the level of emission reduction by investing in Bitcoin mining on a landfill compared to investing in a standard new solar farm. And that was an absolute epiphany. We were like, this is crazy. It's not even close. Not 3 times, not 4 times, 50 times the level of emission reduction. And that's true because, number one, a lot of these, the equipment that's used is not hugely capital intensive. It's much less capital intensive than doing a biogas project, an RNG project on landfill. And the other thing is, again, because methane is 84 times more warming than carbon dioxide, then every ton of methane you're reducing is not mitigating 1 ton of carbon dioxide. It's the equivalent of 84 tons over a 20-year period. So the numbers were staggering. We thought, okay, we've got to do this.
So I have so many questions, and I guess the simple one that I'm gonna ask you, that probably you're gonna answer many of my other questions, is first of all, who is we? What are you doing exactly? And mainly, why aren't more people doing it? Because as you say, it is economically viable, not capital intensive, and very beneficial to the environment. Why is it not being scaled?
Couple of reasons. So my business partner, Harrison Riley, and myself set up the company, and we've got some different advisors, both within the Bitcoin ecosystem and also outside. So we have the skills of Bitcoin mining, infrastructure finance, carbon credits, and also someone with 20 years plus landfill gas to energy experience. So we've got a team of, I would say, real global experts in their field, which we had to do because whilst this had been done for a long time and you sell to the grids, it had not been done when the end customer is a Bitcoin mining company. And so in terms of why no one else is doing it, there's a couple of reasons. Number one, it falls in the gaps between traditional venture capital and private equity. So there's not enough novel intellectual property for a venture capital firm to get in behind this and do equity investments. We could never invest in this wearing my venture capital hat because there's no novel intellectual property. And then in terms of private equity, the projects just aren't big enough. They're typically less than $10 million at a time, which is small. And so whilst that's a good model for solving the environmental problem, it's frankly not a great model for a fund manager. If you're going to be a fund manager, you really want billion-dollar funds so that the percentage you earn as a fund manager is worthwhile, not when you're doing 10 million projects at a time. You're not going to get rich off that stuff. So you really have to think, okay, it's got to be financially viable. But our primary motivation, to be honest, was first, let's solve a major environmental problem, and then let's work backwards to how we make it economically viable.
Shouldn't the environmental ministry of any government be interested in making money and also protecting the environment of their country?
100%. And in some areas, we have got people who are interested at a central government level or at a local government level as well, categorically. In other areas, generally in places like Europe, which have been exposed to more misinformation about Bitcoin, unfortunately, they're not starting from ground zero. So their understanding of Bitcoin mining has been informed by a lot of mainstream media narratives, which are wrong, which were based on what we now know was debunked science or junk science. But again, people have been reading that for some time, and they haven't caught up with the fact that these early studies were debunked. And they certainly don't have an understanding of how Bitcoin has a positive role. So it creates a bit of cognitive dissonance if you start coming in there and talking about the environmental benefits. Unfortunately, you're not starting with someone who has no knowledge. You're starting with someone who thinks they have some knowledge, but the knowledge is based on, fallacies.
I get it. So there's obviously some unlearning to do for these people if they're
Correct. That always takes time.
open to it.
Yep.
Mm.
Fortunately, I think in
So
areas
you,
such as in the Middle East, people are much more open. In the whole North African, in the Middle East, and Sub-Saharan Africa, and Latin America, uh, people weren't exposed to that same misinformation, so they're just curious. So they just don't really
mm.
know anything about Bitcoin. So there's still some education, but it's much faster because there's no re-education to do.
So, I mean, you've been at the forefront of debunking all of this misinformation that obviously Bitcoin is bad for the environment. I think it was based on one single article that's been shared and rewritten and it kind of spread out for
Pretty
years
much.
until, like you said, it was debunked. Yeah.
Yeah. A single study in
How,
2018. Yeah.
okay.
Which changed forms because and the interesting thing about that, it wasn't even a study. It wasn't a properly peer-reviewed study. It didn't go through the normal quality processes because it was a commentary, not a study, which means it didn't have to present novel empirical research. It was basically the academic equivalent of an opinion piece. But the soundbite that it created, which Bitcoin has a growing energy problem, was so compelling that it just
Mm,
went off like wildfire. And the next
mm,
year, you went from less than 10 articles about Bitcoin and energy to more than 400 articles about Bitcoin and energy. And then it created a bit of a spin-off industry where the same author created many spin-off commentaries in one paper off the same study, where he then said, okay, well, Bitcoin also has an e-waste problem. It also has a water use problem. It also has an
yeah.
emission problem. And so, yeah, they were the spin-offs that were created. So it's kind of like, an artist who creates one piece of art that people like and then creates variations, or a musician who creates an album and, oh, that's a sound people like, let's create some more variations. So it's kind of the same thing happened. And it did very well, became very well known, is now very well known for some of the wrong reasons, which because now the truth, karma has caught up with them. These articles have been debunked. But in the meantime, there's a lot of people who have drunk from the poison river of the people who reported these articles. And so that's why there's some unlearning to do.
So let's talk a bit about energy. Obviously, I have grown in a world where it's been kind of eco anxiety. We have to consume less. There's way too many humans inhabiting the planet. And obviously, I have seen pictures and even with my own eyes of rivers completely filled with trash. We have seen so many images of oil tankers, having an accident in the middle of, I don't know which ocean. And then, I mean, you can see that this is obviously not good for the environment. However, can we talk in terms of narrative? Because now we're talking about how government are subsidizing electric cars. We're talking about how AI is going to literally conquer everything and render us obsolete. But AI needs a lots of electricity. Electrical cars, obviously, if everybody is driving one, needs a huge amount of electricity. I guess my question is, how do we combine these two very different views? And can you also elaborate more on something you've said before about energy use being something and environmental harm being something different that usually people connect together?
Yes. We have some major challenges at the moment. There's no question about it. And people have even started there's a big debate within the environmental movement, which happens all the time. It's not one unified movement, just as people who are in the Bitcoin ecosystem don't agree on everything. And so some people in the environmental movement will say that we absolutely need this green energy transition. We need as many solar panels, as much wind as possible. And then there'll be other people who say, well, hang on a minute. Why are we simply trying to find a renewable way to be extremely wasteful? Shouldn't we be looking at these social issues of how a lot of the resources that are taken for solar panels or wind turbines are essentially appropriated from the developing world? in the form of
Mm.
the cobalt you need, the nickel, the manganese, the lithium, etc., all those rare earth minerals as well. And that is a real concern, because it's only through a whole number of mechanisms which are beyond the scope of this podcast to talk about, that have allowed that extraction of wealth from the so-called developing world to the developed world. And without that, then it would be very hard to have that renewable energy transition. And that in itself leaves both a social scar and an environmental
Mhm.
scar. So these are big issues. The other issue is that, yes, of course, should conserve energy. Of course, we've been told by our parents from when we're young, turn off the lights, turn off the stove. Good, you should do that, absolutely. Um, the issue becomes is that right now there's already tremendous waste of energy. Whenever you transport energy through a centralized grid, officially about 7% is lost just by transporting it. Unofficially, it's at least double that. And then a lot of the energy that's created cannot be utilized. You have hydro that during a wet season flows over the outside of the dam, wind, which is produced in the middle of the night when no one can use it, solar, which is produced in
Mhm.
the middle of the day when no one can use it. And people say, well, let's just use batteries. That'll solve the problem. Batteries are very expensive. They're coming down in price rapidly, but they're very expensive. They only have a 4-hour discharge time, which means at the time you discharge them, if wholesale electricity prices are still low, it still makes no economic sense to discharge them. And they require
Mm.
massive amounts of rare minerals. So there's some big issues there, and just saying, oh, we just use batteries. It's not the entire
And
solution.
what do you
So
do
you
with
have to,
it once it's what do you do with the battery once its lifetime cycle
and of
is
course you have
over?
e-waste as well. Yes, so there are big considerations, and look, these are huge issues, and they're beyond the scope of this podcast to resolve. But you're right, you're talking about it's not a simple black and white issue. But then again, if you do nothing, then what do you have? You have more of the same.
Mhm.
And so my tendency was to say, well, okay, these are very complex issues, but where's the low hanging fruit? Where's the thing that
Mm.
everyone can agree upon? Everyone can agree that it's a really bad idea to have methane going unburnt into the air in vast quantities, millions of megatons every single year, and carbon dioxide equivalent from landfills. Okay, let's see if we can do something about that. Um, because even if we stopped, some people say, "Oh, just stop waste." We should, and I agree. We should. We have a consumption-based economy, which is extremely destructive to the environment, and ultimately moving away from consumption-based economy to a needs-based economy, I believe, is part of the solution. That's not going to happen overnight. And even if
Mhm.
suddenly everyone tomorrow just miraculously stopped all waste, you still have another 20, 30 years of these legacy landfills continuing to leach methane into the environment. So let's deal
Mm.
with that legacy issue. So that's been my approach, is you look at these big issues, and if you look at it too long, you just get unfocused and you get overwhelmed. And what's important is that each person, you're cognizant of these big issues. You neither go into denial nor despair, and you just ask the question, well, what can I contribute to? What's a small piece that I know something about, or that I'm curious about, that I can make a contribution to, whether that's some social benefit or some environmental benefit, combination, or whatever. Now, in terms of energy use and environmental harm, um, these get conflated all the time, but they are absolutely not the same. If the energy use is coming mainly from fossil fuel, then yeah, that's going to cause environmental harm. If it's coming mostly from renewables, it's actually incentivizing the green energy transition. And if it's coming mostly from methane that would have gone unburnt into the air, then you want more energy use, not less, because the more energy you use, the more pollution you're destroying, the more methane
Mm.
you're mitigating, the more you're actively reducing um, our most urgent greenhouse gas to reduce. So it
Mm.
depends. It's nuanced. It's a little bit like saying back in the day, the medical wisdom in the 1980s and 90s was um, eating fat is bad for your health. So saying energy consumption is bad for the environment is the equivalent of that. Sometimes it's true, sometimes it's false, and sometimes it's kind of in the middle in a gray area. Yeah, if you eat more trans fats, that's going to be bad for your health. If you eat more
Mm.
saturated fats, that's going to have some small health benefits. If you eat more unsaturated fats, you want to eat as many of them as possible because that's going to lower your cholesterol levels, not raise them. So
Mm.
energy use is a little bit like that. It depends on the type of energy use. And basically, the more flexible it is, the more location agnostic it is, and the more that it's using sustainable energy sources and has ancillary benefits such as stabilizing grids, we want as much of that energy consumption as possible. And it just so happens that there is no more flexible consumer of energy in the world right now than Bitcoin mining, and it's not even close.
I love this comparison you made about eating fat. I have been reading Fiat Food by Saifuddin Ammous, which is an important but very difficult read. Difficult because of the truths that it talks about. But back to Bitcoin mining and back to regulators and changing the minds of people, you have presented recently to over 160 financial regulators coming from around 30 countries. I'm curious, what kind of data or information did you present them, and how was it received?
So the data I presented, it was primarily they wanted to know about Bitcoin and ESG, which is a really important area to financial regulators, because in many places in the world, you need to be able to ascertain and measure and comment on the ESG rating. Now, whether you like ESG or not, whether you think it's a positive for the world or bad, whether you think it started off with good intentions, it's gone off track, or whether you think it's fantastic, doesn't matter. The reality is that right now, if you don't tick that box, then your technology will not be regulated in a favorable way by financial regulators around the world, which means it'll be hard to invest in that technology around the world through sovereign funds, through pension funds, through hedge funds, through high net worth individuals, through pretty much anything. It's going to be more likely to have tax disadvantageous rules and prohibitive rules because people perceive that it doesn't tick the ESG box. So it's tremendously important that we get in front of these people and we just educate them. Because if no one's doing that, then they're going to default to some really old studies and the ones that have been debunked, the ones we were talking about previously.
Yeah.
So really, my work was just presenting the latest data. It's all I do, number one. And then number two is presenting them the latest studies, and number three is presenting the latest case studies. Now, out of those three things, the thing they care about most is not the peer-reviewed studies. Yeah, there's 22 of them saying that Bitcoin mining has a positive environmental impact. There's a lot of data that tells us that Bitcoin mining is now more than, it's 4% sustainable energy based, and they're like, yeah, that's nice. But what really gets them interested is when they see the real life case studies today that are occurring, that are helping to green the grid, that are helping to mitigate methane, that are helping to obviate gas peaker plants at scale. So a lot of the work is just sharing those case studies that they'd never heard about. For example, in ERCOT, the Energy Reliability Council of Texas, where the previous grid operator, the CEO of the ERCOT grid, Brad Jones, was about to have to purchase $18 billion of gas peaker plants. $18 billion. Now, what's a gas peaker plant, and why does a grid operator need to purchase it? Well, because when you put more renewable energy onto the grid, and Texas now has more renewable energy than any other state, including California, rising much faster too, and a lot of the reason for that has been Bitcoin, but also they've had a very pronounced battery program as well, so the two have worked well in concert. But what's happened is in those areas, Brad Jones did some research, and what did he find? He found a couple of things. He was not a Bitcoiner, and he was like, who are these Bitcoin mining companies? What are they doing? Are they deep stabilizing my grid? And people say, well, have a look at it. And he had a look, and he said, oh, they're actually ramping up and down power really fast. That's actually good. How do they do that? And people would explain, well, they're not running one discrete operation like a traditional data center. They're actually running the same operation trillions of times per second. He's like, what? How does that work? And people explained a little bit. He said, okay, I don't need to understand what Bitcoin mining is, but you're telling me they can ramp up and down their power within 500 milliseconds? That's amazing. That's exactly what we need. And you're also telling me that they can locate on a solar farm or on a wind farm? That's incredible. Who else can do that? And you're also telling me that they can participate in our demand response programs These are programs where the grid operator pays users of energy to ramp down their power so that at times of peak demand, they can stabilize the grid. And previously, all it had was aluminum smelters and steel mills. But the problem with them is you only get a 4-hour window before key industrial processes start to break, steel starts to harden. Plus, the factory's either on or off, so it's not very modular. So you could have the opposite problem. You have not enough power, then you turn off the steel factory. Now you have too much power because the steel factory is not consuming, and you've got to tell operators to switch off their generation. Whereas Bitcoin mining can just spin it on a dime and turn out to exactly the amount of kilowatt hours that are needed to be supplied back to the grid. So that was tremendously valuable. That helped him to, again, allow more solar and wind onto the grid. But the most important thing is he now did not need a gas peaker plant. So what typically happened when there wasn't enough solar or wind power, you'd have to ramp up your gas peaker plant. And that would be idling the whole year, just for that maybe 6% of the year when it was needed. So we didn't need that, which meant it was good for the environment because you didn't have it idling, releasing CO2 emissions through the year. But it was also good for electricity prices because you didn't have the cost burden of $18 billion being put onto the Texas population. So many benefits like this around the world. Those were the benefits that the policymakers and regulators were much more interested in. It wasn't the theory, the papers. It was the practical example. This is occurring today. This is occurring at scale right now. 11 nations are now mining Bitcoin. And a lot of the reason they're doing it is, yes, to build up their own Bitcoin strategic reserve, but also to solve some of these variable intermittency and monetization issues so that they can accelerate their own green energy transition. I've been speaking to grid operators and people who are working with the utilities around the world, in Japan, and Australia, and India, and they're all saying the same thing. They're always saying, look, as soon as we started researching Bitcoin mining, we realized it's a solution we've been waiting for, and that we're actually not going to achieve our green energy transition goals without it.
I want to ask you two things. So first of all, what you're saying, because you've drawn a distinction in the past between flexible loads, which is Bitcoin mining, as you said it now, and linked it to the grid in Texas, and inflexible load, which is more the AI data centers. So how could you walk us through like why that difference matters and how potentially Bitcoin mining can help AI scale?
Yes. When you have an inflexible load, such as a traditional inference AI data center, so that's something that, for example, when you do a ChatGPT query, the data center operator doesn't know when you're going to do that query, doesn't know when people are going to do it. So you get very spiky energy demand on those data centers, or a Netflix data center, which you know that it just needs to be up 99.99999% of the time. For a data center to be up that much means you need to have a very reliable source of electricity, and that means typically base load, which is going to be nuclear, or if nuclear is not available, hydro. If hydro is not available, fossil fuel. And in a lot of places, hydro is not available. You need rain, you need hills to create hydro. And in a lot of places in the world, nuclear is not available. So a lot of the time, the more data centers you have which are inflexible, the more fossil fuel generation you need on the grid. Bitcoin mining, however, because it's very flexible, you can ramp that up, you can ramp that down very fast, you don't lose any transactions midstream. That favors partnerships with forms of energy which also are not so much flexible but intermittent. So in other words, as a consumer of energy, Bitcoin mining is much more forgiving. So that allows you to build out your grid using intermittent power sources such as solar and such as wind. So that's one consequence between flexible versus inflexible. It's night and day. The more flexible it is, that supports the green energy transition. The more inflexible, that supports more fossil fuel development. And the second reason that flexibility is very important is if you have inflexible data centers, that puts a tremendous strain on the grid infrastructure. Often there isn't enough transmission lines to be able to support that, or you need substation upgrades. Whereas again, if you have flexible energy demand, you don't have to build the grid for the same peaks because you know you can shave those peaks. And so you can build it for lesser peak demand than you would have to if it was an inflexible source. which means you don't need to spend so much upgrading your grid, which again makes it more effective. So the more flexible consumers of energy, and Bitcoin mining is the world's most flexible consumer of energy, that means that it's going to keep the costs of running the grid down, which means less price pressure for everyday consumers. So there's a couple of
Nice.
really important advantages to being a flexible consumer of energy. Now, not AI, all AI is inflexible. Some forms, such as training, can be flexible. It's not quite as
Mm.
flexible as Bitcoin mining, but again, it's nuanced. So not all AI is bad. All Bitcoin mining is flexible, but some AI is inflexible, some of it's semi-flexible, and some of it's getting a bit more flexible. Now, where Bitcoin mining can help is for those AI data centers that are very inflexible. They're going to struggle to get energy contracts because, number one, the constraint is not going to be demand for AI. It's not going to be the availability of NVIDIA chips. That's not the
Hmm.
constraint. The constraint to growth is the availability of energy, and
Yeah.
particularly the availability of purchase agreements or building your own energy generation assets. And so, unless you're going to get into the business of building your own energy generation assets, which is another topic, but if you're going to go to the grid operator and say, hey, well, we want a contract, the grid operator is going to say, okay, well, I've got these renewable energy transition targets. In some cases, they do. Secondly, I only have so much budget for upgrading my grid. So even though I get all this revenue from you, I'm going to have to spend all of that revenue and then some to upgrade my grid for you to be on it. That makes
Yeah.
no sense. So I'm not giving you a contract. Plus, I'm going to have to put more fossil fuel generation onto the grid. So that's not a good equation. And there's been many cases where AI data centers in Ireland and the US have been turned away from the grid completely, or in preference in some cases to Bitcoin mining companies, such as CleanSpark, who've come in and they've won those contracts because they offer a more flexible consumer.
Yeah.
So what does an AI company do? Do they pivot to doing Bitcoin mining the same way the Bitcoin miners are pivoting to do AI? No, they don't. They don't have to do that. They can keep their core business. All they need to do is they build shock absorption around the edges. They don't have to migrate 100% to Bitcoin mining. They keep doing AI, they keep doing HPC, but that 2% buffer, maybe 2 to 3%, they wrap that round so they use 2 to 3% of their energy for Bitcoin mining. And that is enough that now the entire operation is redefined as flexible load. So just in the same
Mm.
way, if you're driving a truck down a highway where I live in Costa Rica and there's potholes and you've got no suspension, you will break an axle. But if you have suspension, that bit of load balancing, you don't need suspension right for the whole
Yeah.
height of the truck. You only need a little bit to absorb the knock of those little potholes they're going to go over, or those little bumps. And that's enough to now make that entire truck stable and to not break an axle. So it's something equivalent. So these AI companies should look at it as a little bit of shock absorption and not even treat it as an expense, because the reality is the other thing. AI companies, they end up wasting a lot of energy economically by forward purchasing
Mm.
electricity, because you have to buy it so you can secure it. And it's a little bit
Yeah.
like back in the day, you'd buy your cell phone minutes and then you wouldn't use all the minutes at the end of the month. And so those minutes would be wasted. Well, the same thing happens when you forward purchase energy. You don't use all that energy. So that energy you've paid for it, but it gets wasted. Well, that's free energy that they could be using for Bitcoin mining.
Yeah.
So the economics work out. Contractually, it works out because they're going to get onto the grid more often. It's going to make them a better citizen on the grid. And it's also going to, the third issue is those very peaky, spiky demand patterns. That's the last thing a grid operator wants because they're very hard to load balance. So it'll help them to smooth out those spiky demand patterns, which again makes them a better citizen.
You've come up with two very good analogies again. I want to ask you, how often do you check the Bitcoin price, and how much does it matter for you for your long-term outlook? Because beyond, let's say, we've only talked about Bitcoin mining's environmental use case. Are you interested at all in the other use cases or of Bitcoin?
Yeah, very much so. And what's happened over time is I've had a slightly back to front journey because most people find out about Bitcoin as freedom technology or to stop currency debasement or just being a great asset to invest in. And then they find out about what sound money is. And then from there, sometimes I find out about Bitcoin mining. So mine was the other way around. I found out about Bitcoin mining first, didn't know anything about Bitcoin for the most part. And then found out probably a year and a half later, just because if you go to conferences, you can't help but meet other Bitcoiners talking about Bitcoin, finding out, going to talks. Okay, this actually solves a lot of other problems as well as energy problems. I often say Bitcoin causes twin revolutions. It causes a revolution in the financial sector, but it causes a revolution in the energy sector as well. And both will be pronounced revolutions. Now, in terms of what's happened, the two worlds have started to combine because the meeting point for me, talking to more regulators, policymakers, but also sovereign funds, pension funds, family offices, was initially the ESG question. But as I talked more and more, I realized they had other questions about Bitcoin, which were preventing them from being able to adopt Bitcoin as well. And that got me curious to think, well, hang on a minute. Why aren't we talking more about this? We all say we care about Bitcoin adoption, right? We all say we care about number go up. But if you look at the factors that cause number to go up, it's not some MVRV chart. It's not the amount of Bitcoin on exchanges. It's none of those things, right? It's down to capital flows. That's the primary driver of what increases price. But what causes those capital flows? Let's go back a step. Well, when have the big capital flows occurred in the last 4 years? There were really only 3 times when numbers gone up significantly. 2021, Michael Saylor started buying Bitcoin, and on the back of that, a whole lot of corporates' treasuries started forming. Price went up from 20 to 40,000. Okay, and then things kind of went up, they went down, they went sideways, and then the next big concerted movement that stayed up wasn't until the ETF launch. Okay, that created a huge amount of new capital flow into Bitcoin. Okay, so did that just happen out of the blue? No, it didn't. It happened because some people talked to the directors of Fidelity and they talked to Larry Fink. Just in the same way that if you go back to Michael Saylor, he didn't just suddenly become a raving Bitcoiner. He became a Bitcoiner because Eric Weiss talked to him, had a conversation with him. That was a very valuable conversation for all Bitcoiners. Okay, and then let's skip forward a little bit further in time. When was the third big movement? It was November 5th, the election of Donald Trump. Now, but why did that have significance? Had significance because Donald Trump had decided to embrace Bitcoin. Why did he decide to do that? Just he woke up one day and thought it was a good idea? No, someone in the Bitcoin ecosystem, David Bailey, went and had a conversation with him. And during that conversation, he changed his view on Bitcoin, probably for tactical reasons rather than philosophical reasons, but it doesn't matter. Yep. And as a result of that, everything changed. And then and he made that speech at the Bitcoin conference and allied his entire party to Bitcoin-friendly regulations. So 3 conversations, right? Each one was driven by capital flows, but you go back a step further, it was conversations that we had. Now, how many of those conversations are we having? Are we having them on a regular enough basis? Okay, that's 3 significant conversations in 4 years. Is that enough? Are we just going to wait randomly till these conversations just happen to occur? Or are we going to start to get more regular with the frequency of these conversations? We have this massive pool of capital, $75 trillion in patient capital. That's sovereign funds and pension funds. You'd never know it. Hardly anyone on Bitcoin Twitter or on the Bitcoin ecosystem is talking about it for the most part. And if they are, there's these little tweets about when some pension fund buys some strategy shares, which is about 0.01% of the AUM, between 0.01 and 0.1. It's not needle moving. And it should concern us, not thrill us, because what that shows is that pension funds are treating Bitcoin as a tech stock, not as an asset class. So how do we reframe them into thinking about Bitcoin as an asset class, which is the way that Larry Fink has said we must be thinking about Bitcoin? We've got to start having more of these conversations with the people in pension funds, with the people in sovereign funds, with the gatekeepers such as Cambridge University who know 30 of these sovereign funds, and they're all asking about Bitcoin. But we haven't been engaging enough with them in a more concerted way. So when we start to get more systematic, I sometimes say to people, Bitcoin doesn't need a security budget, it needs a marketing budget. Nascent altcoins and altcoins are outspending Bitcoin by 10 to 1, sometimes 100 to 1 on marketing. Ripple launched a $5 million campaign against Bitcoin to attack it on environmental reasons, using Greenpeace USA as a proxy. The people who are defending Bitcoin We're doing it as volunteers. That may work at a point in time where everyone's kind of heroic activists, but for Bitcoin to evolve and to become a mature global asset, we have to do things in a much more coordinated way. And we have to work much more as a team where the people who are the right messengers and have the right messengers are combining with the people in Bitcoin who have the networks and the resources. And together we come together and we have more of these conversations, because that's the only way that we're going to have pension funds and sovereign funds, this major new asset class, see, or rather this major pool of capital.
Yeah.
That's the only way that they're going to see Bitcoin as an asset class, not as a tech stock. And it's not impossible, but nor is it inevitable. It happens through our proof of work. So this has been something that I'm going to be speaking more about at the Bitcoin conference this year, about how we do that, why it's important we do that, and what happens if we don't do that as well. And I think that a lot of our greatest enemy is complacency, the assumption that it'll just naturally happen. If we just wait, just organically, because Bitcoin is such a great asset, that sooner or later, pension funds and sovereign funds will embrace it, just in the same way they did alts, in the same way they did equities. And now alts is 8% of their AUM and equities is 53% of their AUM. Well, yes, as I said, they will embrace it, but how do they embrace it? Right now, they're embracing it as a tech stock, which is less than 0.1% of AUM. If we want them to embrace, and just one of a basket of digital assets, okay, if we want them to embrace it in that way, we don't have to do anything. But if we want them to embrace it as a new asset class, that's going to require engaging with them in a more concerted way, in a more regular way than we have to date.
Yeah, I totally hear you. And at the same time, Bitcoin is always, we talk about Bitcoin being decentralized, Bitcoin having no marketing team. But Jeff Booth likes to say often, we are Bitcoin. I'm going to be very excited to see how the efforts of Bitcoiners are going to converge towards, just like you said, reaching these very deep pool of capital who do not yet understand the asset class of Bitcoin. Daniel, I want to be respectful of your time. Thanks a lot for coming today and sharing all your insight. I have a final question for you. As you mentioned, living in Costa Rica, can you share what do you like about living there? How different is it from the other places that you've lived in the past?
Costa Rica is great. It's always the right temperature, particularly in San Jose where I live. It's never too cold. It's never too hot, which is awesome. And it's rainy for half the year, but it's normally rainy at a predictable time in the afternoon, so that's fantastic. People are friendly. The country's beautiful. And it's a place I'm enjoying living. And the other reason I like it here is it's next to a whole lot of landfills. Not in Costa Rica, but in Latin America. I didn't move to Costa Rica for the beaches. I moved for the landfills.
Wow. We're going to quote you on that. That is a pretty amazing quote. Thanks again, Daniel. I did not have time to run through half of my questions, so hopefully we can have you back in the near future. And good luck to you in the coming weeks and months. Thank you again.
Thank you. Okay. Bye-bye.